and we did it on May 1st, which was a Sunday on a sunny afternoon, and we were astonished to have over 250 people pouring into the building. It's absolutely first, which was a Sunday on a sunny afternoon. That tells us how deep concern these issues go in the general community. And then I said to my colleagues in religious studies, we need to do it again on campus because we knew that the Eureka site was very inconvenient and it was during finals. So I'm especially grateful to our speakers who agreed to speak again. Bill and Lena are here for the second time, and Saeed here for the first time in this particular program. And many thanks especially to Sarah, our program chair, who pulled it together because I wanted the students to have a chance to experience what those in the community had experienced. And I also see many members of the Arcadia community also here. So terrific. Thank you for coming, and we're all going to learn a lot.
Thank you, Naomi. I just want to say a couple things, and then we're going to hand it over to our presenters. Thank you so much for being here, number one. This promises to be a really great program. And thanks to my students who are here. If you're here for RS 105, there is a sign-in sheet back by the coffee. At some inconspicuous moment, you might put your name on it. Please do that. And to the community members, thank you so much. This is one of our efforts to bring community to campus and really engage the campus dialogue, campus community dialogue on a matter of great importance to all of us, especially as we near voting day. One thing that I want to mention is we have at a table in the back by the coffee some information on religious studies courses that are being offered in the spring, experiential workshop programs. Lena's course from the spring has a flyer back there that you can check out. And so there's some information back there that you might look at. In particular, there's information regarding the Father Eric Freed Peace and Justice Award, which was established by the Religious Studies Department after Eric's unfortunate and untimely death in 2014. It's now newly this year been officially inaugurated as a Humboldt Area Foundation Scholarship. So we have information on that. We're pretty excited about it because it's the beginning of a legacy we hope to continue, really honoring the work that Eric did within the program and within the community. And so not only did it sort of coincide to the availability of that information coincide with this event, but this event really coincides with Eric's own dedication to community campus dialogue, to a conversation based both on scholarship and faith. So if you're interested in hearing more about that or knowing more about that or further information, you can of course ask me. My name is Sarah Hart, or you can check out the information at the back table. So without further ado, I want to introduce very briefly our first speaker is going to give a slightly more detailed introduction, but we are so grateful to our presenters for coming here and sharing their expertise, their knowledge, their time with us tonight. And one thing that has happened is that we're extraordinarily fortunate to have both Professor Herbertsmeyer and Professor Mortazawi from Business and Religious Studies in reverse order with us, both of whom are emeritus at this point, and who have been together working to discuss and bring to light questions of Islam, Islamophobia, the Muslim world, questions of terror, questions of Muslim-American relations for decades on campus. And so bringing them back into this conversation is a delight for us, and to have Professor Galasha Dina, who is now in history, a new hire in Middle Eastern Studies, to be able to come and join this conversation is also delightful. So I am thrilled, and I am going to hand over the mic now to Professor Herbertsmeyer of Religious Studies.
Take me a second to hook up the mic here. I think it's not too difficult. This will work. Yeah, it's a great honor to share the stage with Saeed and Lena. Saeed and I have worked together many times over the years. Lena's relatively new to campus, but the little bit of work I have done with her and the work I've seen her do is pretty outstanding. But generally speaking, one of the things I'd like to say from the outset, if you're a news junkie like I am, you watch CNN or Fox or Democracy Now or whatever, when you're dealing with Saeed and Lena, you're talking about people that talk about these issues at a similar kind of level, the best you're going to find in the public news, and way better than 90% of the people who talk, who don't know really much of anything, and they don't pretend really to cover things honestly. So yeah, I'm really honored to share the stage with them. Both of them are very candid, they're very direct. They're very well informed, and this is something that is not in large quantity in our society. We're talking about especially controversial issues. And when you're dealing with understanding Islam in the American context, particularly in this circus of an election season, we're really very fortunate to hear what they have to say. I'm going to just say a few words, and then I'm going to allow, not for me to allow, but Lena's going to discuss issues of the history of colonialism in the Middle East. Saeed is going to discuss issues of militant Islam with a special focus on Iran. And they both have PowerPoints and stuff. I don't have any PowerPoints. So let me just say a couple words to begin. This is about understanding Islam. That's the title. That's what we want to accomplish. And I'm just going to say a couple words at the beginning, and then later on I'm going to try and stitch things together with a broader perspective on how this reflects understanding Islam. First thing I'd like to say is that if we're going to understand Islam, the first thing we have to do is to get beyond all of the stereotypes and projections that we bring from our own minds onto Islam, as opposed to what we should be doing, understanding Islam in its own terms and what Islam has to offer and, so to speak, the reality on the ground. And of course, one of the things that is the most important in obscuring our vision of Islam is the current climate of Islamophobia, the tendency to see all of Islam as being characterized by terrorism and violence and extremism and so on. And this really is a horrible caricature. And there's been plenty of discussion about this. Barack Obama has been abused because he refuses to use Trump's favorite phrase, or one of his many favorite phrases, radical Islamic terrorism. And we can talk about that later, but basically Obama has good ideas on why he doesn't do that, but it doesn't break through to many people who insist on circulating these stereotypes. And I won't go on and on about that at this point, maybe later. But what I want to say in the first place is just a real simple statement of what Islam is about. And of course, I'm a non-Muslim, I'm a secularist. I think all three of us are secularists. We're not advocating for Christianity, for Judaism, for Islam, for Buddhism. We're secularists, for academics. But just in terms of the basic observation that good, clear, critical scholars would make about the nature of Islam, I find that William Montgomery Watt's statement, who's a great scholar of Islam, he was the person who put Muhammad on a good, solid, scholarly footing in the West back in the 1950s. He said that the basis of Muhammad's early message was, number one, there is one God, which could be summed up in the Shahada, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. Right? Excuse my bad Arabic. But there is one God, Muhammad is his prophet. And what that asserts in a broader sense is there is only one God. It is the monotheistic God of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob, of Moses, of Jesus, and Muhammad is understood, and Muslims understand Muhammad to be an extension of that tradition. And the Quran is the direct revelation of God through Muhammad to people for our benefit. Okay? That's part one. A lot more to be said, but I'm keeping it short here. The second basic principle of Islam, as Montgomery Watt saw it in Muhammad's early vision, his early pronouncements, was that Islam is a religion of justice. It's about people treating each other with justice and to battle against injustice. In this sense, I want to quote Desmond Tutu. I heard Desmond Tutu speak in a very intimate setting when I was in graduate school in New York. And in this, he was thanking people all over the world for supporting the movement against apartheid. But since Desmond Tutu, Nobel Prize winner, Anglican bishop, wonderful human being, one of the things that he said was that it's very hard to believe it at certain points, but it's basic to the Christian message, it's also basic to the Islamic message, that God takes sides. In matters of justice, God takes sides in favor of justice and in opposition to injustice. And this can be a complicated question, but it seems to me basic to all of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and if we go back before the emergence of the classical traditions, it's also true of Hebrew Bible and the earliest forms of the religion of ancient Israel. The third part of what Montgomery Watt articulated was there will be an accounting. I'm putting it a little bit differently from the way that Montgomery Walker put it. But there will be an accounting. When God takes sides, it makes a difference whether you're on the right side or whether you're on the wrong side. Sometimes people put an excessive weight on the afterlife. In other words, good people go to heaven, bad people go to hell. That's extremely simplistic in any of these three faiths. But the notion that God makes an accounting of who has done the right things and who has been abusive is very important. When you think these three things through, these three basic principles through carefully, you see that they are part of Judaism and Christianity and Islam all three, and that Islam is articulating in a certain kind of boiled down sense the heart of the tradition. I think that, all such theological questions can be argued until cows come home, but I think that there is a lot to be said for that simple reduction to basic principles. If you keep these concepts in mind as you're listening to the history of colonialism in the Middle East and the history of militant Islam with a focus on Iran, I think you can see that the concerns of the people in the Middle East, particularly, Islam is much broader than the Middle East, of course, but the Middle East is of particular concern. You can see that there is some just cause for Muslims being concerned with the injustice that Muslim peoples have suffered in the wake of Western colonialism. Okay? And I'm not going to say a lot more than that right now. I'm not going to say anything more than that right now. I'm going to turn over the mic to Lena, and she's going to dazzle you with her intellect and her intelligence. And this
Hi, good evening. I'm going to start with an apology. For those of you who've seen me lecture before, I might be a little disappointed today. I'm a little sick, so my usual energy is not fully there, but I'll try my best. I'm very, very happy to be here in this event, which is a part of a week of dialogue on race at HSU. A very necessary conversation we should be having here, and I'm really happy this is also a part of this conversation because there is no significant Muslim minority in this area or anywhere in the 6 hours drive in every direction. But I think a lot of the questions that apply here apply for the same issues. How do we treat difference? How do we categorize people? And honestly, we've been listening to not even Trump alone, the presidential candidates who have seen that immigrants become a target, and who then becomes an immigrant is actually automatically turned into brown in its all variations. So the discourse here is very much tied into that, and I want people to keep that in mind. And in the spirit of keeping this conversation, I wanted to plug in myself a little bit, sorry. I'm trying to start a film series about the Middle East that will try to bring together the community and the university. And this will be the second film in the series. It's a brilliant, beautiful film called West Beirut, which is basically traces the beginning of the Lebanese civil war through the prism of two children who witnessed it from the beginning. So the film will be at Richard's Boat, and there will be a talk back afterwards for questions. And I hope to see you all there. Now to my topic. I'm a very avid secular and also very much avid about not speaking in for Islam or about Islam. I'm a historian of the modern Middle East. So my talk will be very much from that direction. And in fact, you will see that my first slide actually is from the present. So as a historian, this is a little tricky to start from the present and go back. But the question I want you to keep in mind is, how do we get here? Right? And if you watch the American news, you have one answer to how do we get here. They're terrorists. Their culture is a culture of death, it's a culture of terrorism, and that's why there's this much death and destruction in the Middle East. In case you're not familiar with the news, Syria is on fire, and pretty much thank you the whole world for setting it on fire and sitting and watching it idly while it basically gets destroyed completely. The U.S. has a very significant role in it, and that's why we have to be proactive about it. The second one is even more direct connection, in case you were not inclined to do the analysis of 2 steps. Your weapons, your money is paying for weapons that are going and killing people in mass in Yemen, because our very, very democratic leading ally, Saudi Arabia, is very much in part of that. And speaking of allies, Israel is also continuing its policy of making a Palestinian state impossible in the West Bank, and in the process, and more importantly, making people's lives miserable on every day at every turn, but also with American dollars. In case you had any doubts, President Obama had proven to us that unless people get up and speak out, Israel will continue getting money under the pretext of, they're our allies. Well, he promised me he's not going to expand settlements anymore. Didn't he promise? Of course, that took only 1 week to break. So in order to kind of say, how did this come around? And to give you an answer that is not culturally based, i.e. one that does not say they're utterly different from us, and they have a culture of hatred, and that's what it is. I said let's look at history, and history will tell us a very different story. And I'm not looking at the history of the whole world, I'm just starting at the 19th century, at when the Middle East really starts coming in contact very intensely with quote-unquote the West. And here I'm kind of very careful about those terms because they're very problematic, they're very constructed, and if you want to learn more about that, I'm teaching a class on colonialism and a class on the Middle East next semester. So if you take both my classes by the end of the semester, you can get all the ways that you can distinguish between those terms. But in what we understand the Middle East, and this is now kind of more spoken about as Middle East and North Africa, the 19th century is a crucial turning point. This is a point where the West, i.e. the European powers, colonial powers, are actually not only starting to notice the Middle East, they're starting to notice the whole world. Africa, within the last 3 decades of the 19th century, is all colonized almost to the end. I think there's one state that escapes that, which is Liberia. The Middle East is caught in this new capitalist process, which is the Western countries needing to get raw materials for cheap and to export their ready materials for expensive. And the Middle East happens to be very unlucky because it sits in this very, very strategic place for that. So the colonial powers begin looking at the Middle East and kind of deciding how they split it up and how they not split it up from the 19th century. Iran is, I don't know if you can see Persia on the cat, but Iran is trapped between Russia and Britain in their interest and competing geographic and strategic interests. As I usually tell my students, if you ask any questions about Britain for pretty much most of the 19th and 20th century until the end of colonialism, it's India. So Iran unfortunately sits very close to it, and then later, of course, then they have the oil. But that's the situation. And all of the other European countries, are basically trying to figure out what to do with the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire. It is not only, doesn't remain in the plane of planning from very early on, 1830, French colonialism in Algeria basically marks a drastic change in the lives of people in the Middle East. The French colonialism of Algeria began with an extremely violent campaign that continued to be extremely violent basically until its last day. The French suppression of any Algerian resistance, and there was plenty of it, was ruthless, and it also was Orientalist. And I'm very, very briefly going to explain this idea. Orientalist means basically this post-1980, Orientalist becomes this idea of looking at how people in the West construct this place as the East, the Orient in general, but particularly in the refer about the Middle East. And the idea is that in order to justify colonial interest, in order to justify a position of power, people in the West, including academics and scholars and beautiful artists and literary characters, start creating the East as this completely, essentially different place that is other than us, and is inferior than that of other than us. I.e., those Algerians are inferior to us. They don't understand anything but power, and we are there to civilize them, to bring to them the beauty of that what is Western and civilized. Now, of course, I hope that you are all able to chuckle about the idea of going and killing people in mass and destroying their culture in order to bring to them a civilization, which is basically the destruction, because the Algerians certainly didn't see much of the French Enlightenment beyond many oppressive policies, including a massive settler colonial project, which basically turned all of the country's resources into the hands of a few settlers. At some point, not enough French people were going to Algeria. France offered citizenship to any European who would come to Algeria, just to basically get white numbers up. And I'm saying these things because I want you to I'm saying it in this way because I want you to think, where does it resonate? What are these kind of games and language being used? But the game doesn't end there. Britain takes over Egypt in 1882 in a direct colonial occupation after a lot of influence there. And in Lebanon, the French interventions basically, and American missionary schools basically create sectarianism. And so when you read the story about Lebanon and Iraq, you read it's sectarianism because Sunnis and Shiites hate each other from forever. Well, actually, no. The idea of a Sunni or a Shiite identity as a distinct political entity is a modern thing. Yes, people practice religion in different ways, and there were some animosities that were not understood in the modern sense that we understand identities as a conflictual thing. This whole idea of nationalism is a very modern thing. And in Lebanon in particular, the European interests, which basically the French supported the Catholics, the Maronites, which are kind of Catholics, and the Americans supported the Protestants, and the British supported whoever, the Druze, I think. That's basically where sectarianism begins and takes root. And that's a process that the British also create in Iraq later on. So basically, the Middle East, by the turn of the century, is already feeling very heavily the European presence in it. And it is at this point that the Muslims in the Middle East and beyond start asking questions of what has happened. So if you want to think about political Islam, and I don't use any of the terms that are very acceptable in the public discourse, but if you want to think about political Islam, the core question is, what has happened to Muslims that they are now in this situation that is inferior to the West, that allows the West to come and occupy? And of course, the answers are a very large range. So there's a whole secular movement, secular nationalist movement, the Nahda, the Renaissance, the Arab Renaissance, that basically has nothing to do with religion. And it's all about culture and education and the status of women, etc. And then there's also some religious explanations that try to kind of deal with this incursion of Western dominance, economy, and direct occupation into their lives. And those questions will only increase and become more severe as time goes on. But the most crucial moment in the Middle East is World War I, I believe. World War I severely changed forever the map of the Middle East. It created states where states never existed, and it basically divided the Middle East according to Western interests with no regard to the people who lived in it and their desires. The war itself was a horrible time in the Middle East. European colonial interest meant a global war, because World War I was indeed a world war, where people around the world suffered from its repercussions, including in the Middle East, where there was massive famine because of the blockade in the Mediterranean and because of the forced recruitment of the army, because of the war that took over in the place. But more importantly, the war and its aftermath really changed not only the Middle East, but its relationship with the West. And that mainly has to do with failed promises and agreements and that during the war. And to understand the manipulation that was going on among the colonial powers about the Middle East, you need to understand the three main agreements that were going on regarding the Middle East at the same time. The first agreement was the Constantinople Agreement, in which basically European powers decided that since they're fighting the war that they started, they have right to split the Middle East according to their own interest as a reward for that war. So from this perspective, they started negotiating things. And the first map on the, seriously, how am I going to do that? That way on the right is basically what the Arabs could have understood as the promise of the British for supporting the establishment of an Arab state. Good or take. I usually tell my students, the British, who are amazing cartographers, somehow failed to draw that map. Hint, hint, what they had in mind. But while they're making this promise to the Arabs, if you revolt and basically attack the Ottoman Empire from the south and weaken it, and basically make the war easier for us, we will help you get this state. The Arabs follow their part, and if you've ever seen or read about Lawrence of Arabia, that's the guy who was involved in this whole project. Britain, in the meantime, went on to negotiate with the French. The French were taking the brunt of the French warfare in Europe, and they wanted to guarantee their interest in the Middle East. The British, of course, wanted their own interest in the Middle East, so they divided the Middle East according to their own interest. And there's a lot of colors, but basically, the French wanted modern-day Syria and Lebanon. The British wanted Palestine because it's next to the Suez Canal, which leads to India. They wanted Iraq because it has oil and it also is on the way to India. They basically split the Middle East according to that interest. And then the third promise during the war is the Balfour Declaration, in which the British promised the Jewish national movement, the Zionist movement, homeland in Palestine. Now, of course, again, there's vagueness. What does homeland mean? And what does mean in Palestine mean is all Palestine. But also beyond that, Palestine at this point had 5% Jews after 10 years, no, actually 20 years of immigration. It had 5% Jews and the rest were Palestinian Arabs. But the language of the agreement, of the promise says Jews have a national home in Palestine, and the non-Jews, and Arabs are not even mentioned or worthy of mention as a group, they get civil and religious rights with no acknowledgement of them as a group. So with that stacked very much on one hope that Arabs and many others around the world have actually comes closer to home for you. The Wilson, I actually, it's very funny, when I came to the US and realized how the Wilsonian dream still has resonance, it just amuses me, because people in the Middle East would just laugh their ass off at this idea that someone still believes that. Because Wilson said, let's talk about self-determination, right, which is actually Lenin's term that then Wilson gets credit to, but that's a different story. But Wilson, already in the language actually of the 14 points, you can see the difference in terminology. If you're European, you get self-determination. If you're a former Turkish empire, you get govern yourself, which is again another big language. But even that, and in case anyone had any doubts, he actually sends a commission to the Middle East, the King Crane Commission. People are very, very aware of what's going on. They're very adamant. We do not want mandates. We do not want the French. We do not want the British. If we had to take anyone, we will take American mandates. Of course, think how theirs have passed since then. Of course, Wilson packs up and goes home, and the British and the French get to divide the world the way they want. I know the maps look at the same colors, which I think is actually very neat. But if you look at those maps very closely, you will see that the top map is the mandate system, the bottom map is the sites we hold. Lo and behold, they look very similar. The world is divided according to the colonial interests, but they are also named in a very nice way, rendering assistance until a time when they can become independent. Under this ruse, the Middle East was under colonialism for the next 2 decades and beyond. But at this point, I'm going to stop for a second and mention another little piece of interest of the Middle East. This is when the first crude oil gets discovered in the Middle East for the first time. The first oil is 1902, faith in Iran, but by the point that they discover it, see that guy all the way in the end, William Darcy, the Iranian Shah, who was very, very into lavish lifestyle, but also in a desperate attempt to modernize, quote unquote, the country to win off European interests, sold all rights to any oil in Persia, still the Persian Empire at that time, to William Darcy, who then basically puts on all this campaign to go and find oil, finally finds oil. By 1914, the British government had owned most of the Iranian oil with an agreement that gave Iran, or Persia, and then later Iran, 16% of the revenue of the oil, where Britain got to keep the rest. That agreement continued to be in effect until 1953, when another American beautiful intervention in the Middle East prevented the Iranians from getting their rights. But we'll get to that. So basically, the Middle East at this point is at the heart of the interests of so many colonial powers. And if you look at the map, the numbers are kind of interesting. You see there's this gradual decolonization. Egypt gets independence in 1922, Iraq gets independence in 1930, except none of those are real. It's independence on paper. Britain continues to control, and France continues to control. Actually, France, even after they acknowledged the independence of Syria and Lebanon, it took basically force to get their army out. The world of the Middle East is very much shaped by continued colonial presence until the 1950s. In the 1950s, something changes in the world. Well, several things. What is referred to as the third world, the colonized world, basically starts standing up and resisting colonialism, and increasingly in a unified front, increasingly in a self-identified way, as being the colonized, the people who are oppressed, and they're going to fight against it together. And so do the people of the Middle East. 1952, Jamal Abdel Nasser has a revolution/coup that throws out over the old regime and actually finally gets rid of the British. Remember that 1922? 1952 is actually when the British are finally forced out. Actually, 1956 is when they're fully forced out of the Suez, the last place where they had their army. In Iraq, a similar dynamic, 1958. But at this point, the old power players, Britain and France, are exhausted from the war, and now we have a new boss in town. The new boss in town are the Americans, and the new game in town is the Cold War. Everything in the world is measured according to Cold War eyes. If you're with us, or you're against us, you're good or bad. So the new regimes, the anti-colonial regimes, because they're not with us, become the bad guys. They become basically the terrorists of the time. They didn't use those terms quite, but basically, if you read what American media and presidents and everyone was talking about those guys, it was those, basically they're communists and they're going to cause us trouble, so we need to do everything to overthrow them and get rid of them. And there's a lot of attempts to it. And then the good guys are on the other side. And the good guys are the ones who give up their oil for pretty much for free, like Saudi Arabia established in 1932, very much under American tutelage from pretty much day one. And then but that package gets changed a few names, but basically the older regimes that agreed to be a part of the anti-communist regimes are kind of at the heart of who is us and who is them. And the American tradition of basically supporting any dictator who guarantee our interests basically starts then and continues until today. The measure is, of course, we're going to talk about democracy, and we're going to talk about who has civil human rights violations and all these things. But the measure is you're either with us or against us. And if you're with us, then we will enable you to be a dictator, we will give you the weapons, and we will give you the intelligence, and we will do everything in our power that you can stay in power. So for instance, Saddam Hussein gets lists of more than 10,000 communists, but from the CIA to go and murder in a murdering spree. Because, well, it's him. He's willing to talk to us versus those communists. Remember what happens to him. 20 years later, he's no longer with us, and that's he's a dictator and he's horrible. And we need to go bring democracy to Iraq. But the reason I'm highlighting this so much is because this is basically the relationship with the Middle East is very much shaped. The names changed. When Soviet Union falls apart in 1990, it's no longer the communist versus the free world. It's a little bit of a different name. And of course, we're so used to this us versus them that we couldn't live without it. So we switched it to what is it? Islamo-Chinese civilization now is the enemy. Yes, literally someone went and invented this whole unity of this Muslims and Chinese as a civilization that is against us, the free world. But the clearest place where we can see this dynamic is Palestine. The colonial influence in the Middle East is most seen, if you want to see it, is in Palestine. So remember that Balfour Declaration that gave the 5% the land of Palestine and disregarded the Palestinians. It continued, basically the British enabled Palestine, the Jewish national movement to expand and get hold in Palestine until 47 when they no longer could stay there again after the war. The UN decides to divide Palestine into two parts. 56% to the Jewish population, 43% to the Arab population, and international Jerusalem and maybe Bethlehem and Nazareth. It's not very clear, but holy Christian cities. The Palestinians, in their criminal mind of insisting that they are not going to give up their homeland, rejected the partition plan. And the punishment was there was no Palestine created. This is the map. In 1948, Israel was established on the ruins of the Palestinians. This is a map of where most of the Palestinians now continue to live in refugee camps. The Palestinians called it the Nakba, catastrophe. And at this point, the U.S. took a very clear position. It wavered for a minute in March 1948, but from that point on, and actually already from much earlier, Wilson supported the Balfour Declaration, for instance. The U.S. basically supported one side and vilified another side consistently. It continued to develop this discourse that we now have, which is there's one good side, which is Israel, which is a part of this free world, right? And it gets different variations, and the Arabs as the terrorists. They're always the bad guys, no matter what. And one of my students is writing a paper where one of the things he was noticing is how it's always Israel retaliates. It's always Israel responds to the Palestinians. The Palestinians that had conducted a terrorist attack, Israel responds. Israel retaliates. It's never, we don't get this subtlety, but it's a part of this discourse. And there's amazing books if you're interested. For instance, Melanie McAllister writes about the Exodus, early 1964, where the Zionist movement actually commissions the book that becomes very, very influential in shaping a whole generation. And if you watch this film or read the book, the insidiousness of the demonization of the Palestinians in it is just unbelievable. The comparison of the Zionist movement into the kind of the manifest destiny. Israel becomes us, and it's constructed that way in an American psyche, in an American imagination. While the Palestinians are constructed as the constant villain. No matter what happens, the Palestinians are the villains. 1,500 Palestinians get killed in 1 week in Gaza Strip, they're still the ones to blame. And their numbers are never mentioned. And their pictures are never mentioned, and God forbid their names. But unfortunately for the Palestinians, the U.S. becomes the broker. And certainly since the 1980s, when the Soviet Union was no longer able to be a part of the story, the U.S. becomes the one player in town in this game. And that one player, as Professor Rashid Khalifi, a Palestinian-American historian, calls it, is a broker in the sea. It's a broker who is supposed to be the broker in the peace process, and it's a broker who consistently did everything possible to prevent a fair agreement to the Palestinians until today, until those $320 million that we just gave Israel to say, you can continue ignoring the Palestinians and their rights. So when you try to think about why the Palestinians do something and act something and why they would burn the American flag, it's not because they're hatred of blind hatred. And by the way, it's really a silly act. Who cares? You know, you could go ahead and burn every flag in the world. I don't care. And no one should care. But the symbolism of it is Palestinians could be bombarded and die with American weapons, and that's okay. But if they dare burn a Palestinian flag, it's because they're terrorists and they have a culture of hate. And that's how we come to understand Muslims. That's how Muslims also come to understand us. Because unlike Americans, people in the Middle East are actually aware of this history. Maybe not in its fullest, but they know this history. And this is a part of the dynamic, but it's also a part of the continuing struggle of the people of the Middle East. When people in Egypt have to look out, they have to remember that the US administration helped Mubarak stay until the last minute possible, and then helped Sisi come and take control and become the dictator in Egypt. And that's a dynamic that we should keep in mind very, very closely. Thank you.
It's really tough to follow such a beautiful presentation, but I'll try to do my best and talk about political Islam. And especially, I want to talk about Iran, my homeland, and talk about the political regime in Iran. However, a little bit of background, I guess, is needed if we are going to talk about political Islam, either in Iran or elsewhere. And then that goes right to the very beginning of Islam. Prophet Muhammad died in 630 CE, and right after his death, the issue of leadership of Islam became an issue. And Muslims, in a sense, were divided from the very beginning. The Sunni Muslims believe that the leadership has to be selected by the community, and they actually did select Abu Bakr as the first caliph, and then Umar, Usman, and Ali ibn Abi Talib. And then they were called rightly guided caliphs, right after the Prophet. After the fourth caliph, the Umayyad, basically in a war, took the institution of caliphate and turned it into a dynasty. And they created the Umayyad dynasty that was centered in Damascus, and until the Umayyad dynasty was toppled by the Abbasid dynasty, and the Abbasid became the caliphs. And the Abbasid were in Baghdad until the time that the Mongols conquered Baghdad and put an end to the caliphate life. Somehow, when the Ottoman Empire started, the Ottoman Sultan claimed that he has dreamt in his dream that the last caliph of Abbasid has passed the institution to him. Therefore, Ottoman Empire basically assumed the institution of the caliphate. And they continued until World War I, as you heard, when the Ottoman Empire was defeated, and that put an end to the institution of caliphate at that time. It's quite interesting that the Sunnis are the majority of the Muslims, as opposed to the Shiites. It is quite interesting from political viewpoint that the Sunnis, majority of them, they would like to see caliphate to be reestablished. In a sense, as the center of the Muslim community, to represent the Muslim community. The Shiite Muslims, on the other hand, they didn't believe in this line of leadership. They thought that the leadership had to stay in the Prophet's family, particularly passing to his son-in-law and his cousin Ali. And then the leadership is going to remain within the family of Ali, at least according to the Persian or Iranian version of the Shiism, until the 12th Imam that has disappeared and is living in occultation, and someday is supposed to come back and put justice on earth again. So, if we really want to summarize the political philosophy of the Sunnis versus the political philosophy of the Shiite Muslims, that the Sunnis believe in the institution of the caliphate. They believe in the community of the Muslim to take an oath of allegiance to the Caliph. You notice that, for example, Mr. Baghdadi, who is the head of the ISIS, declared himself the Caliph. And other terrorist groups like Boko Haram, for example, immediately later on, they basically took the oath of allegiance to the ISIS as the center of the, in a sense, in their opinion, the Muslim community. The Shiite political ideology, on the other hand, can be centered on the imamate, which is the leadership in the family of the Prophet, and the 12 Imam who now is living in occultation and someday is going to come back. And the issue of justice, although is the raison d'etre of Islam, it is particularly important to the Shiite Muslims for the reasons that perhaps will become clear later on. So, in order to talk also about an Islamic government, an Islamic regime, we need to talk about Islamic law as well. Because by the 10th century, the Muslims were able to put together the Islamic law. And the Islamic law comes from 4 different sources that were used to develop Islamic law. The Quran, of course, the book of the Holy Book of Muslims, is number 1. Then the tradition of the Prophet, because the Prophet lived especially as a political leader during the time that he was in Medina for 13 or 12 years or so. And therefore, his sayings and his tradition has become a part of the Islamic law. The rule of reason is very significant in Islam. There's a slight difference between the Sunnis and the Shiites. The Sunnis consider the rule of reason, qiyas, to be basically reasoning by analogy, and the Shiites assume is reasoning by deduction. Okay, very minor difference between the two. And finally, the consensus of the community, or what is called ijma, because there's a saying of the Prophet that he says, I'm paraphrasing it, that my community will never make a decision in error. Therefore, ijma will become also a part of the Islamic law. Now, what is really needed to know that Islam, just like Judaism, is a law-based religion. And what is really the difference between the Islamic law, or as opposed to the common law or the civil law, the European law, is that Islam would recognize the rights of individuals as well as the rights of God. You may change the rights of the individual, perhaps based on ijtihad, based on reason. But the rights of God is unchanged. You cannot change the rights of God. So what has come in the Quran and is considered to be the right of God has to be exercised. So the Islamic law has put a disciplinary code, in a sense, to deal with both rights of individuals as well as the rights of God. The rights of individuals maybe would be transactions. If you like, the Islamic law has an equivalent to the business law that would tell people how to make contract, what will happen if you cancel the contract, so on and so forth. But the rights of God is really summarized in the acts of worship. And the disciplinary code is over there in order to make sure that the rules and the laws of Islam are going to be implemented. Of course, in addition to the disciplinary code, there is going to be ethics and the behavioral norms that is in conjunction with the Islamic law that would govern the Islamic societies. So, what do we mean then by Islamic state? Any state that would consider itself to be Islamic is going to believe in the absolute sovereignty of God. It is going to implement Islamic law, Sharia. You hear left and right that Muslim communities, they are asking for Sharia to be implemented. Creation of an egalitarian and just society, perhaps based on the Islamic teachings. Absence of separation of church and state. Separation of church and state is not acceptable in Islam, because Islam is a total way of life. It's governing not only your responsibility towards God and towards religion, but also your responsibility as a Muslim, as a citizen, as a part of the Islamic community. And of course, the leadership of Islamic State, that if you believe in Sunni Islam, is going to be summarized in the Caliphate, and if you are a Shiite Muslim, is going to be summarized in the Imam. So some basic objectives of this Islamic state or concept of Islamic state. Amelioration of the social and political and economic inequalities through implementation of Islamic law. The Quranic symbol of its balance is extremely important in Islam. Several times in the Quran is referred to the balance, that God's creation is in balance. And if you like, if you want to use a modern terminology, God's creation is at equilibrium. And anything that would cause the God's equilibrium to be interrupted must be dealt with. And that's the responsibility of Islamic State to do that. So God's creation is in balance. Now, this is really important. When we say God's creation is in balance, it doesn't mean, and we are going to talk about equality in Islam as well, it doesn't mean that every Muslim is equal to every other Muslim. God has created the world in balance. Good and bad exist at the same time. Okay? Therefore, you will see that an absolute equality doesn't really exist in an Islamic sense. Men are supposed to be above women. Okay? Free men are supposed to be above slaves. Therefore, within each class, there is going to be absolute equality, meaning that women are going to have an equal rights before the law, but Islam does not consider Muslim women to be equal to Muslim men, etc. We can talk about that later on. Muslims have to deal with a man-made injustice. If you see that man-made injustice has been created, then it is your responsibility to fight against that. That will perhaps show you the attitude of the Muslims toward the injustice in Palestine. Because for more than half a century, one nation has been living in basically prison, and that's clearly considered to be injustice, and you have the responsibility to fight against that. Of course, when you fight against that, when Hezbollah is doing that in Beirut, we are going to consider them to be terrorists, okay? Some other issues about the Islamic state and Islamic government. Equality before God, everyone is equal before God. As I said, Islamic justice does not imply absolute equality. Absolute equality doesn't exist. Men are not equal to women, free men and women are not equal to the slaves, so on and so forth. In a sense, the concept of separate but equal that you are familiar, that very much in America, is very much the concept that exists in Islam. Islamic justice is primarily of distributive form, meaning that the function of the Islamic government is through taxation to redistribute wealth in order to generate an egalitarian society. And finally, the last thing that I want to say is within the Islamic state or within the Islamic form of government, the concept of freedom is a very limited concept. In a sense, you are going to earn your freedom when you are going to fulfill your duties towards God. Actually, I have a quotation also from Hegel for you here, that more or less it seems that it's saying the same thing. It is in duty that the individual finds their liberation. Okay, that will bring us to the case of Iran. Something that perhaps most of you do not know, that Iranian Revolution of 1979, its intellectual foundation is really an anti-colonial third world movement. The two of the Iranian intellectuals that I'm sure that most of you have not heard of them, Jalal al-Ahmad wrote a book called West Toxication, arguing that the identity of Iranians lost because they have embraced the Western ideas. At one time, if you go to north of Iran or to the east of Iran, Persian language was lingua franca, that it was spoken all the way to India. And then suddenly, the British come to India and they eliminate Persian as the official language of India, and they replace it with English. So I am not argue that if we are going to recover our own identity, we have to get rid of this disease that is called Westoxication and return to ourselves. Another intellectual, Iranian intellectual, Ali Shariati, constantly talks about return to self. And it's really interesting that especially Shariati seems to be a direct follower of the Franz Fanon. Franz Fanon was again a French revolutionary and anti-colonial writer that every Iranian perhaps knows, and every Iranian intellectual considered himself or herself to be, to some extent, a follower of Fanon. And of course, in addition to that, we have this battleground of Samuel Huntington, Clash of Civilization, that put Muslim against the Western cultures, that to some extent, it seems that, at least in the mind of many Muslims, that is already happening, meaning that there is a clash between the two cultures. Now, a little bit more about the Iranian Revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the leader in a sense of the Iranian Revolution, wrote a book called Islamic Government, actually in 1960s. And in that book, he established a new institution for Shiite Muslims with reference to the 12 Imam who is living in occultation. He used two hadiths by one of the Imams. It's interesting for the Shiites, not only we are using the Prophet's hadith and tradition, we are also using Imam's hadith and tradition. So he uses two hadiths by the sixth Imam of the Shiite Muslims and argues that in the absence of the rightful leader, who is going to be the 12th Imam, the person who needs to lead the Muslim community must be a jurist, must be a person who knows the law, must be completely familiar with the law, and be able to make decisions as if the hidden Imam is going to make those decisions. And that has given rise to this institution in Islamic Republic of Iran that we call it Rahbar, or the leader, the supreme leader, because the supreme leader is a jurist who supposedly is knowledgeable about Islamic law and about the tradition in Islam. And it is making decisions as if the hidden Imam is going to make those decisions. So governance of the jurist, or Velayat al-Faqih, is one of the most important aspects of Islamic Republic at this time. Now, we know that Iran is one of the early countries that was conquered really by the Arabs. And actually it took about 200 years for the Iranians to become Muslim after they were defeated by the Arabs. Because initially Arabs, especially Umayyad Arabs, they were pretty racist individuals. They thought that Islam was brought only to the Arabs and not to anyone else. And as a result, they divided the community that they had conquered between Arabs and Ajam. And Ajam in Arabic is a person who is dumb, cannot speak the language, cannot understand the language, etc. However, later on, it seems gradually, within the next 200 years or so, Iranians gradually became Muslim, and Islam became the dominant religion of Iran until 1500, that the Safavid dynasty in Iran chose Shiism as the official religion of Iran, particularly in order to put themselves against the Ottoman Empire, because the Safavid Empire constantly was clashing with the Ottoman Empire. So concentrating on Shiism versus the Caliphate in the Ottoman Empire seemed to be a very good political move on the part of the Iranians. So since then, Iranians have become Shiites. So majority of the Iranians are Shiites, about 95% of the Iranians are Shiites. Shiites are basically the minority within Islam, meaning that most of the Muslims around the world are Sunnis. Now, what is interesting, as my colleague was talking about the issues in the Middle East, the first time that the Iranians tried to reconcile Islamic law with the European laws to create some kind of constitutional monarchy was in 1906. The Iranian constitution was passed in 1906, and you must remember that in 1906, half of the Europe had absolute monarchy, meaning that constitutional monarchy was not such an important institution even in Europe. But you heard that Iran was caught between the British and the Russians. Actually, a part of this balance of power in Europe, that every time that Russians were taking advantage, the British would join the opposition in order to put the Russians in their places and vice versa. So by 1908, simply the constitution was put to rest, and the British and the Russians brought the absolute power to the monarchy in Iran, which was the part of the Qajar dynasty, and absolute dynasty more or less reestablished. In addition to that, again, you heard also that oil was discovered by the British in Iran. And the king of Iran, not because he was so progressive and wanted to modernize Iran, no, because he was a lackey of the British Empire, mostly gave this wonderful prize to the British to the extent that when in 1953, the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran nationalized Iranian oil industry, Prime Minister Churchill called him a madman because he believed that the Iranian oil belongs to the British. And he wanted to invade Iran at that time, but President Truman stopped him, and he was not able to do that until President Eisenhower came to power, and this issue of communism, etc., was good enough that the British were able to convince President Eisenhower that if we do not remove Mossadegh from power, then communists are going to take over. Therefore, they arranged a coup in Iran. They removed the democratically elected prime minister and brought the Shah of Iran back to power until in 1979, Iranian revolution happened and he was toppled, and the Iranian Islamic regime was established. Now, the last thing that I want to show you is the political structure of the Iranian regime at this time, and then perhaps hopefully we can talk about some of these issues through questions and answers. The system that is created is very unique in a sense, that some portion of the government structure is elected directly by the citizens, and some portion of that is not elected. So if you look at the electorate system, the citizens of Iran are directly electing the members of the parliament, and they are also directly electing the president of the country, who is going to basically establish his or her cabinet. In this case, all of them have been him, his cabinet. Interestingly enough, the leadership of the jurists also has created something similar to the Catholic Church in Iran. Although Islam is a non-hierarchical religion, meaning that there is no hierarchy or established church in Islam, but Iranians have created this office of the supreme leader in a sense very similar to the way that the Pope is being elected. So the assembly of experts that are being elected by the citizens are going to select the supreme leader, and then the supreme leader is working with the Guardian Council, and supposedly Guardian Council is capable of removing him from power if in case he violates the laws of Islam. And the members of the Guardian Council, half of them are elected by the citizen, half of them are appointed by the jurists themselves. There is a mixture of the jurist system and a direct election by by the citizens of the country. But what is important, then the supreme leader is in charge of particularly the judiciary part of the government, meaning that there is no independent judiciary in Iran. The judiciary is really working under the leadership of the supreme leader, and then he is also controlling the armed forces in Iran. So he's a very, very powerful man. He has the veto power on everything that the government is going to do. And it's interestingly enough, again, the misrepresentation of the media in the United States. When Ahmadinejad was the president of Iran, they were pretending as if he was the leader and he was making all of the decision, although he was really not that important. And Khomeini was the first supreme leader after he died. Now Khamenei is the first supreme leader. And still some people doubt that when Khamenei dies, whether or not the supreme leadership is going to last, whether or not there will be a next supreme leader in Iran, or the leadership in that sense is going to be returned to a community of the jurists that are going to control Iran. Since they have come to power, they immediately faced an unjust war that was supported by the United States. The United States basically greenlighted Saddam Hussein to attack Iran. Saddam Hussein used chemical weapon on Iranians, and none of these intellectual news people in this country even acknowledged them. So it was okay to kill Iranian using chemical weapon until the time that Saddam Hussein became a bad guy, and then we had to remove him from power. From day one, this government has acted under a significant number of sanctions that is imposed by the West on Iranians. And despite the fact that President Obama finally signed this treaty with Iran in order to more or less put an end to the nuclear development in Iran, but Mrs. Clinton already is sending a signal that she is going to impose new sanctions on Iran when she comes to power. For what reason, God knows. Because there is a proxy war right now between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Saudis, in addition to now the Israelis, have unconditional support of the United States. The criminal regime in Saudi Arabia can do anything that they want because, in a sense, they are friends of the United States. Killing people in Yemen, and if Iranians are objecting to that, or they are trying to help the opposition in Yemen, then the Iranians become terrorists. When Iranians are supporting Hezbollah in Beirut, which is, by the way, is considered to be more or less the force that has put back Lebanon together, then Iran is the supporter of terrorism. Therefore, we have to put new sanctions on them. Those are the issues that needs to be studied by people who are educated, people who are intellectuals in this country, and not to accept basically the nonsense that you hear on the media. Okay? It is amazing that these investigator reporters, just like parrots, they repeat basically what Pentagon wants them to do, as opposed to really investigating what is going on, what is the issue in the Middle East, and how it has to be analyzed. They're basically repeating what the government wants them to do with respect to the issues in the Middle East. In my opinion, the Iranian government has aimed for really political economic independence. And believe it or not, they have done a relatively good job. Scientifically, they have done a very good job. Economically, they have done a good job, despite all of these sanctions that have been imposed on them. And politically, it seems that they have done okay, because now look at the sphere of their influence all over the Middle East. As opposed to the previous regime and the previous two regimes that were basically lackey of the United States, and whatever the United States wanted, they were doing. Certainly is not a perfect system. It's not a perfect government, but it's an improvement. It's a step towards the right direction. I stop over here, and hopefully we are going to be able to talk about these issues with each other.
Well, I hope you agree with me that Lena and Saeed got an awful lot to say. And if you could keep up with all of that without any prior introduction, you're doing pretty good. I've been reading this stuff for a long time, and I can't quite keep up. I'm going to try and keep my final remarks pretty short because Saeed and I have done a lot of events like this. We haven't done so many in recent years, we've done a lot of them. And the things that makes them really good is when we start to get audience involved, people can ask questions, we can answer, we'll keep our answers short and so on. So anyway, I'm going to try and keep my comments short. Would you try to keep it under 10 minutes, Sarah, please? In case I get lost. It's the academic disease. You give a professor the podium and they never stop. I know I'm good. I thought first part of my first remarks would be based on where Lena started. She showed pictures of Palestine and Syria and Yemen, of course. But you could also show Iraq, Libya, Morocco now, if we could show the prisons in Egypt. So she asked the question, how did we get here? And later on she talked about Orientalism. So the question is very largely, how did the Islamic world come to be subordinate to the West? Something Paul Blank taught me years ago. Paul Blank, great professor of geography here, now retired. You know Paul. Learned a lot from Paul about Middle East, Islam, and so on. He said that before the invention of sailing ships, that all-important 16th century, where Europe was spread out and conquered the world because we mastered compasses, sailing ships, and gunpowder, and all that kind of stuff, it was the Islamic world that dominated the Eurasian continent because they controlled all the trade routes, but it also meant that they were the pinnacle of civilization. But gradually, step by step, Islamic civilization was reduced to a subordinate state under European colonialism, not just in the Middle East, but all the way from Morocco to the Philippines. Right? I mean, if you overlay a map of European colonialism on the Islamic world, you'll see that practically the entirety of the Islamic world had been colonized. This is a huge problem of theodicy, the problem of how do you justify the actions of God whereby the just people are abused and the unjust people triumph. Within the Islamic world, this is a big problem of theodicy because if the Islamic world is a world which was created, theologically speaking, through the Quran and through the influences of the Prophet Muhammad, the Islamic world should be supreme. Besides, the Islamic world was a very just world in many different ways. So, but certainly from the inside of the Islamic world, it's a big problem. All right. So this is a fundamental question. If we move to the modern period, I'm not going to repeat everything that Saeed said, obviously. Seems to me that one of the reasons that, especially in the later part of the modern world, we got where we got is, and I got 2 points here, very general points, but really worth considering, I think, is that when you don't listen to the moderates, you get the extremists. So there have been plenty of voices from within the Islamic world and from the colonized world in general. It includes South America, it includes Southeast Asia. There are plenty of moderates that are asking for justice from the colonizers. But we never listen to the moderates. So who do we get? We get various forms of extremism, right? And then, of course, we can call them savages. You create the conditions whereby the only people that get a voice are the people that respond with extreme measures, violence, attacks, whatever it might be. And then we claim them to be savages, which justifies our ability to attack. Noam Chomsky's talked about how the West is always looking for somebody who's easy to hate. Then you can justify your bombings and your killings and your colonialism. All right, that's fine. The other side of it is, and this is something I learned from Saeed many years ago. He said, you showed me this little map of the Iranian government. He said, this is not the democracy we would like to see. This is not the democracy that a lot of Iranians would like to see. But there has not been the opportunity for Iran to develop the institutions that would allow for the development of a democracy. Think about all the things that we have in our democracy, or Britain, or France has its democracy. A free press, an independent judiciary, free and fair elections. Just add up all those different things. But those institutions have been systematically destroyed in the Middle East and all over the Islamic world in virtue of colonialism, right? Okay, so another fairly simple point. This was something I read some years ago by the great French historian and author Maxime Renisson, who wrote a wonderful biography of the Prophet Muhammad. And the way he discussed the problem in the modern Middle East was to say, when Muslims look at the world and they ask the question, again, lead us question, how did we get here? And also, very importantly, how do we get out of here? He said, you know, the people in the Middle East have looked at the two major models, because remember, this is back before 1990. The Iranian Revolution, really the burgeoning of Islamic radicalism. But even before that, with the Munich Olympics and the attacks by the PLO on the Israeli teams back in the early 1970s, right? These things were building long before the demise of communism. And so what a lot of people in the Middle East were saying and throughout the Islamic world was, well, we've seen communism. We've seen Western capitalism and its democratic institutions. And neither one of those groups have treated as well. Remember Lena's picture up here of Persia, and you got the bear and the lion, you know, they're fighting over the spoils. And so they said, can't we turn to our own civilization and find a better model? And of course, the Islamic theorists think that they can, right? And I think there's good reason to believe that they can. Where do they find that? Well, they find that in the life of the Prophet Muhammad and in the Quran. In my Islam class, we spent a long time looking at the life of Muhammad, reading the Quran, and so on. One of the things, I mean, I think you can say this with some considerable confidence as a historian, as a sociologist, as a cultural theorist, not just somebody within the religion, that Muhammad is probably the most, he's certainly one of the most influential people that have ever fought on the planet. But as a founder of a major religion, he may be the most remarkable. Because Muhammad not only was somebody who proclaimed a doctrine and had a prophecy and so on, but he established a state in this little oasis, roughly on the scale of Arcadia. Seriously, I mean, the geographic boundaries, the population, that's about what Medina was, right? And the way that that society was put together, when it spread out from Medina, it scaled up to be the governing system that ruled international empires all the way from the Pyrenees, through Spain, across North Africa, across the Middle East, Persia, India, and so on. I mean, if you're a believing person, you might conclude that that's the hand of God. It's not that hard to make that conclusion. I talk about Medina as being a utopia that is no utopia. And there are a lot of ways in which that paradox works. But just for simple purposes, the society of Arabia in those days, back in the 600s, right? 622 is the beginning of the Muslim calendar. Put that date in your head if you don't have any guys. The society around there was going through huge turmoil. The pre-existing culture, the pre-Muslim Arabian culture, was in a radical state of decline because most of its institutions were failing, new institutions were coming along, and so on. And what Muhammad was able to do through preaching in Mecca and through establishing a Muslim community with some considerable political power in Medina was really, I think pretty seriously, to solve most of the major social problems that were confronting the people of the time. And you can look at somebody like the Buddha, you can look at somebody like Confucius, you can look at somebody like Jesus. God knows I have a lot of respect for all those people. In many ways, I like them better than Muhammad. But one thing that they never did, they never wielded the power of the state. They never were able to take their views on religion, on spirituality, on law, on morality, and so on, and make them a reality in the state. But Muhammad was able to do that. And he got his hands dirty. He was the head of state. Barack Obama, great guy, but he drops drone attacks on people and so on. You're going to be a head of state. You're going to get your hands dirty. Muhammad got his hands dirty in some ways. But he was also a master negotiator. He worked towards solutions that made things work for everybody, right? Maybe a little overstatement. If we had a historical discourse on academics, we could quibble over these things. But for a purpose like this, and in dispelling stereotypes, it's not a surprise that Muslims will look back at this and see that this was a magnificent accomplishment out of their own culture, and something on which their whole culture was based, right? So, I don't want to keep going on and on here. But let's get really clear about something. Because this was the beginning, and because it developed as a tradition, as that tradition developed among the, Sai gave a really nice overview, among the Umayyads, among the Abbasids, with the Ottomans. He didn't talk about the Mughals, I don't think, right? Or many, many other parts. There were many intellectuals who reflected on a variety of things. So when we look at, I'm going to try to tie the loop on my comments here. So when we look at the modern circumstances in the Middle East and we see the way that Islam operates, we continually want to focus, as Lena says, and you know that this is true, they're all terrorists. We create the conditions that breed terrorism. Then when people become terrorists, we blame the terrorists for being terrorists, right? Meanwhile, we've stopped all the institutions that would make it a more civilized culture from exercising their control, right? So when we look at the problems that we now see in the Middle East, we're looking at the problems in the Middle East in virtue, well, back to worse. When we ask how did we get to where it is, the point that Lena is making in her opening remarks is something that is recognized by everybody in the Middle East. If you travel to the Middle East, you talk with people, they all know all of this stuff. There's a broad spectrum of opinion. There are people that are secularists. There are people that are Marxists. There are people that are moderate Arabs. There are Shiites. There are Sunnis. A relatively small minority of them are actually what we might call militant Islam, or whatever you want to use to define terrorism, might in some sense terrorists. People like ISIS. But these are aberrations that come because of the impossibility of institutionalized Islam, of developing itself and to maintain the traditions that they had earlier on. And I would really encourage you, like Said was saying, you turn to CNN, you turn to Fox News, you turn to MSNBC, even if you're, there must be some Democracy Now! Watchers in here. Even in Democracy Now!, you don't get really good, clear commentary about Islam itself. You might get good commentary on the political circumstances in the Middle East, but not much on Islam. And so I'd really encourage you to turn to a very rich literature that we have on these things. There are books that are written on the life of Muhammad. There are books that are written on Islamic civilization. And understand that the creation of the terror that we see, and therefore the caricature that we place of Islam, is very largely our responsibility, not the responsibility. You're trying to make me sound like it. So anyway, that was my point.
Thank you, Bill. So I'd like to suggest that we give our presenters a moment to take a breath. If you'd like to have a coffee, grab one. If you need to use the restroom, it's right outside the doors, but we will come back and bring it down to question and discussion. So please stick around for that in 3 minutes. We'll give you 4 if you need 4. Coffee, tea, water, back.